I am very pleased to announce our next speaker, who is Mark Cocker. Mark is literally one of Britain's top naturalists and nature writers. And he has just published his 13th book. And EA Festival Edition 3 is the official launch event for this book. And considering how prolific and eminent Mark has been, because over the years, he has written more than 1,000 articles for Britain's leading broadsheet newspapers, as well as writing a country diary column in The Guardian for over, well, how many years is this? Since 1988. So it's a huge honor and privilege to be able to launch his book today. I also wanted to point out, in referring to EA Sustain, a new festival that EA Festival launched in January of this year in Colchester, that Mark was one of my biggest collaborators, and he's my regular brainstorming partner in coming up with the content and programming for that event. If you would like to attend it this in 2024, take a note of the dates, the 13th and 14th of January. And then, last but not least, and if you love our talk today, I also wanted to draw your attention to a talk and a walk that Mark is going to be doing on Shimpling Park Farm, which is outside of Bury St. Edmunds, on the 21st of October. This is also going to accompany a nature writing workshop, if I'm not, is it a nature writing workshop and a walk? Or it's nature writing immersion morning, 9 to 1 on the 21st of October. And seriously, if you are interested in attending, the Pawsies, John and Alice, at whose farm this will take place, are there in the corner. And they're also very involved with EA Sustain. So without further ado, I'm now going to dig into Mark's extremely meaty book, which he has literally been writing, or not writing anymore, but he began writing and taking notes for it as far back as 2007. So now, Mark, how could it be, considering that you've written 13 books, some of which took you 10 years to write, that this one actually took even longer?
Well, I was doing other work at the same time, but I started off with the idea, I started to realize about 20 years ago that I only had really obsessed about birds, and I started to unravel other parts of life, but particularly insects. And so I started to piece together the idea of a book which would explore the interconnection across all of life. It's very difficult for me to describe what this book is about, but all of life is in there. And so therefore finding the structure for a book which was taking me into areas which I didn't really know a great deal about, such as the fact that all life originates, nice Freudian slip, in red light, is essentially the first principle of all life. And so I wanted to try and find a symbol that would encapsulate or serve as a sort of ongoing symbol through the whole book. And I started off with blackbirds, and the first notebook was called Blackbirds, but I actually meant the thrush, the common blackbird, Turdus merula. And I started off then I evolved it. I thought I couldn't kind of make this thrush serve all my purposes. So I then incorporated the blackbird and the swift. And then I worked a little bit further on it, and then I abandoned the blackbird, very sadly, because it is my favorite bird. And thought the swift served this purpose of uniting the whole planet. And in many ways, it is a perfect metaphor for the interconnectedness of all life. Do you want to go on?
No, you were going to read a quote, actually, from the book, which describes one phase in the life of swifts, which are their birth.
Yes, the reason why swifts were so appropriate is they perform these extraordinary lifelong migrations. Don't think of it as a bird that lands in your house or that it's a bird that's yours. They're not our swifts. They don't even live on terra firma. They live in air. And this seemed to me, because the biosphere is surrounded by an atmosphere, this seemed a very good way of talking about the atmosphere. And also swifts do some of the most remarkable things. One of the most extraordinary things is that they emerge from their nest once. And when they emerge from their nest, they don't sort of flap around and go, yeah, this is great, I love this, I'm going to learn to fly. They fly instantly for the first time ever. And they have to fly properly and may fly from then on for 3 years without landing. So this is a little bit about their relationship with that moment. The intended outcome from all this surplus insect energy is a nestling which at roughly 56 grams is marginally heavier than its parents. The extra weight is deliberate. Subcutaneous fat equips the soon-to-depart chick from the next test, which is surely the ultimate energetic tightrope that it must cross. The young swift has to have a little excess weight to see it through the bottleneck of independence, yet not too much that it could compromise or impair the first decisive flight. What faces a young swift is a metamorphosis no less than if it were a larval insect bursting from the chrysalis as a winged imago. What hatched as a toad-mouthed lizard has already morphed into a light-wreathed angel, but now it must go from a condition of complete reliance upon parents to independence, instantly and without alternative. It must launch itself from a dusty, dark roof and fly out to the sun. There are no second chances. It's a one-shot deal. It must fly, but fly perfectly, having never done so. It must simultaneously learn to feed and do so immediately, for in a matter of days it will fly and feed as it journeys over continents. Is there any greater transformative magic in all bird life? Well, actually, there is. This morning before lunch, I mentioned how I am in awe of the ability of some South American swifts to endure nesting conditions that leave them permanently saturated with spray. The sound, sights, and sensation of submersion are a birthright for these underwater creatures, but they must emerge into daylight like every other swift from behind the force field of a waterfall. In northern Argentina, the falls of the Rio Iguazu are framed in a 4-kilometer horseshoe of raging torrents. At the main channel, the well-named Garganta del Diablo, the Devil's Throat, the cataratas plunge nearly 90 meters, and from this vomited spume, there belches back a perpetually smoking vapor. Here the young great dusky swift will burst forth, anointed and baptized by the deluge, at a place that is among the most sublimely beautiful on our planet. To break that riverine hymen, to plunge through the liquid egg sac into our atmosphere. How must it feel for these miraculous earthlings in their moment of rebirth? We can only dream.
Do you want to write like that? You can always go to this workshop. Okay. So Swift, so ostensibly, the framework of the book is that it's a day in the life of swifts, but it's so much more than that, Mark. So why don't you give us an outline and a framework of the modus
Yes.
vivendi of your book?
Well, I've always been steeped in nature writing in which one pays careful attention to the facts. But in this instance, I needed to find a format. I'm also very interested in nature writing as a genre. And nature writing as a genre, as it seems to me, kind of being subcontracted by memoir, so that most nature books are becoming about the central writer of the book, all their problems and how nature cures them. And that seems to me just an extension of the instrumentalism, which is at the heart of our relationship with nature and is causing the catastrophe of climate change and biological loss. So I wanted to decenter myself from the story, but also find a kind of, not fictionalized, but using the devices of fiction. So I invented one day in one garden, which is a reference to the book of Genesis, which is where we explain to ourselves how all life is just a kind of, is there for our purpose. Man shall have dominion over the earth and all crawling insects thereon. So I wanted to use a biblical reference, but I also needed to include more science than I've ever embarked upon trying to master, and astrophysics and astrobiology and how life began. And this was a real challenge for me, because I not only wanted to tell these stories, but make them amenable and accessible to people. So the chapter I'm most excited about is the chapter on bacteria, which of course was, I write books because I'm interested in these subjects, and I sort of think, well, I'm guessing other people will be interested in this. But the whole foundation of life is truthfully bacteria. And you're thinking, well, bacteria, they're not really related to me. Well, you carry within you, in every cell of your body, the ghosts of the origins of life from 3.8 billion years ago. So we are intimately connected in our instance, and I won't go into the great detail of it, but through your mitochondria. Essentially, mitochondria are the organelles in your cells which deliver energy to all parts of your living, respiring system. And those were borrowed in an anschluss of two bacteria, probably about 3 billion years ago. So the main architecture of life, the main chemical processes, were all worked out by single-cell organisms. We have John and Alice over there, we probably have other farmers. All of your farming is essentially dependent upon the health of the bacterial organisms in the soil. Soil itself is made from, probably originated in the Silurian, when animals first, or organisms first crawled out of the ocean onto terra firma for the first time. This was just bare rock for most of the history of the planet. But about 500 million years ago, creatures started and organisms started to come out. The first organism, creating the first soils, preparing the ground for plants, were lichens. Now, lichens are an interesting organism. We call them lichens as if they're one thing. Actually, they're a collaboration between a photosynthesizing bacteria and a fungus. So they are really two things in one. And so I wanted to tell all this kind of complex stuff, but tell it within an entertaining story. And I hope that using this one day through which I try and explain all the parts is how, go on.
Okay, so I want to refer back to a comment that he made when he was explaining the cause of climate change, and he said that it was actually man's approach of instrumentalism to nature, which is largely responsible to climate change, because the bacterium chapter actually considers man's place in the chronology of the universe. And that is why one of your lines in that chapter is, bacteria has always been the only game in town.
Yes.
So tell us about how, because of our anthropocentrism, we tend to think of the beginning of what is important to be the birth of humankind, when in fact bacteria have been around literally since the beginning of time, and their importance, and why this is misplaced, how we conceive of our own timeline.
Well, the book is also, my subtitle for it originally, before my editor vetoed it, which is now Swifts and the Story of Life on Earth, was Science and the Imagination, because we are unique in terms of all species for many reasons. The fact that we're holding a festival at this incredible place is just one very, very small expression. But we are unique species in this sense also. We threaten now the entirety of the biosphere. 96% of all the mammalian biomass on the planet, 96% is us and our livestock. And the other 4% is the John Cleese sweeping plains of wildebeest across the Serengeti, all the Sagai and all the camels across Mongolia, everything. The rainforest full of monkeys, that is the other. Every rat that scuttles, every deer that crosses the road is the other 4%. So we're having this uniquely devastating effect on our own planet. But we are doing what all species do, which is looking after number one. But we have this thing called language and culture and imagination, and it is attendant upon us, as I see it, to try and subvert the impacts of the impacts of our species. We have this kind of responsibility to do something other than ourselves. So what I wanted to do was map out, in a sense, across the book, all the interconnections to show that you are actually, I mean, the other side of this is the species most threatened by our devastation is not the biosphere. You know, the very idea that we are destroying life. No. Forgive me if you have any aspirations to that kind of hubris. The first species that will go is most of ourselves. Life is utterly invulnerable. It is such an extraordinarily embedded 4 billion year old synthetic system. And I just wanted to show that everything about us comes out of our relationship with the rest of life.
Right, so to put it another way, the story of human life began 4 billion years ago, not 300,000 years ago, and that is the upshot, I believe, of a lot of the story of bacteria. But that's just one chapter. We don't need to. We can also just, what are some of the other relationships and concatenations that you're able to draw in your book?
Well, I mean, I had a lot of trouble fighting with my publishers to get in. I described 3 meals, 3 imaginary meals, one of them including, if any of you have ever visited Derbyshire or Staffordshire, one of them was Staffordshire oatcakes, of which I'm a great fan, Derbyshire oatcakes. And I had a long chapter about my breakfast and my lunch and my dinner, because if there's any imaginative pressure point where we can see our relationships directly, it is in what we put in our mouths. And of course, that is the central relationship which is driving much of the problems of our planet. It's not just the 8 billion of ours, it's the fact that we have extended what George Monbiot calls agricultural sprawl across vast areas of the whole planet, depopulating and reducing systems to grow livestock in a very, very inefficient way. So plants are an extraordinary, one of the central stories is about our relationship with plants, and I'll just give you one small example. All around this beautiful garden at Headingham are all fantastic flowers and colours, and you will have noticed, I saw some of you looking at this extraordinary tree out here with these extraordinary blooms on it, the flowers behind us, out there are all sorts of roses. And you're thinking, or we think, that we create these gardens and that flowers flower somehow for us. Well, no, that's not true. Flowers exist only for one other organism. We need to love our inner insect because flowers flower for pollinators, essentially. It's an advertisement, as good as E.A. Sustain's own advertisements, for the insects to do the sex life of plants for them. They co-opted the neurological system of insects to do their reproduction for them. If Rowan Pelling is here, she'll be interested in that fact. But so angiosperms are a set of organisms that I write about in a separate chapter. And angiosperms are literally, if you turn around now and you look at that greenery, you are looking at angiosperms, 330,000 of them. The predominant biomass of the planet is this set of organisms which evolved in the Cretaceous. Everything, every grass blade, every flower, every tree, with one notable set of exceptions, cycads and pines and conifer trees, are all angiosperms, which started to evolve about 130 million years ago. So rainforest, John and Alice's farm is completely dominated by this set of organisms. And insects have an essential relationship with angiosperms because that's the first time that the planet went multicolored. And all the technical color that we see across our planet is this collaboration between insects and plants. And it just seems to, and one of the other interesting facts which leads us back to food is that every third mouthful you put in your mouth, every third mouthful of food is down to this relationship between insects and plants. And something like 460 billion pounds of crops, of pollination, is done by insects for us, and they don't charge us a penny. So next time you want to kill that fly, restrain yourself, because flies are, even flies are pollinators, but beetles, most insects, moths. We're doing a moth night, just to give you one tiny illustration. Primroses. Is there anybody who doesn't love primroses? Well, primroses are pollinated by moths. And we'll look at moths on Shimpling Farm. So that's the kind of relationship which I myself, sort of in my tunnel vision, didn't grasp fully when I started charging out into the world as a 13-year-old birdwatcher, chasing after birds. And slowly, I've expanded my imagination to do something which I think is very important, which is to connect things up, to link one thing to another. So I've become a terrible jack of all trades, but a specialist in none. But for me, that that connectivity is at the heart of the imaginative process in the book.
Fantastic, Mark. Okay, that was a lot of ground to cover. Tell us there's some crazy facts about insects here, which I just want to share with you. By the way, this book is crammed full of science and discovery, but beautifully written, as you could hear from Mark's recitation of even that small passage. Did you know, however, that ants are roughly equal in biomass to humankind? I just want to tell you how important insects are. But we're going to now go back to the book. But what is the relationship? Because I was saying that the book is crammed full of science, but of course that makes for extremely dry reading.
Well, yes.
What is the relationship between science and art, or what do you
Science and
fact and feeling is what you say.
Yeah.
And one of the most important quotes in the book is fact and feeling are not self-canceling.
No.
So what does that mean, Mark?
Yes, okay. Well, one of the challenges was to make this science as tolerable and as accessible as I possibly. I'm an English graduate. I studied Thomas Hardy and D.H. Lawrence and George Eliot, and I'm not a scientist. So even now, I had a conversation with a fantastic guy. We're trying to get to E.A. Sustain to talk about light, because I didn't quite grasp light, and I realized there are errors in my book. So I wanted to make it as accessible as possible. But the critical thing for me is that I had to tackle science, because science has uncovered, over the processes of the Enlightenment, over 400 years, but particularly latterly, these deepest interconnections that have moral force, that kind of shape the way we should see life. The trouble with science, of course, is that everybody thinks of it as an objective automata type thing where we strip away human emotion to get at the facts. We have to, as it were, try and remove ourselves and our innate prejudices and biases to get at the facts. But I have always struggled with this issue of emotion and knowledge as being two separate parts of the engagement, because I feel very strongly for nature, but I also love to know about it, and I don't feel that knowing is somehow a barrier to loving. So I see this as a false dichotomy. We will not reconstruct our way to a relationship with nature by according nature a different pronoun. We can't reconstruct language, but we can start to see that these facts are leading us to an understanding of our own self-interest with the rest of life. And so at the end of the book, I sort of talk about, I have an episode where I'm standing looking up at the night sky. One of the interesting things about swifts, and the swifts are, as I say, I haven't hardly talked about swifts. You probably thought it was a book about swifts. But swifts do this extraordinary thing. They fly up at night into the sky 4 kilometers above the Earth. Actually, we're finding that they do it more at the beginning of the day, at pre-dawn, about this morning, probably about 3 o'clock. So the swifts that breed in the keep at Headingham will possibly, the non-breeding one that's not sitting on eggs, and I'm going to take you, if you want, I'm going to do an impromptu thing at 12:30 for anybody who wants to look at swifts and still hasn't worked out how you separate a swift from a swallow. Well, at 12:30, I'll be by the keep, and you can come and see them with me. But this process of flying up above the Earth to 4 kilometers is true of almost all swift populations. They've started to put these tiny little recorders on their backs, weighing less than 1 gram, and track swifts in all their movements. And it seems to be that swifts travel up above the Earth every morning to look at polarized light, to see what cloud formations are happening, possibly. We don't really know why they do it. And I'm sat there in the end of the book looking up into the darkness and saying, this darkness would be less magical for me because I couldn't imagine that swifts are above my head. So the fact that I know this, even though I can't see them, brings me a kind of imaginative sense of connection. And so I see knowledge as really fueling our imaginative process. It isn't a barrier. You know, we need to know stuff to feel things. And I cite two very famous romantic writers, a line from Wordsworth, we murder to dissect. Well, I occasionally murder insects to dissect them, to know which species they are. Yes, and the other writer was D.H. Lawrence, who I'm a great fan of, working class boy from Nottingham and the Derbyshire border, like me. But Lawrence was fixated with the idea that because we knew the sun was now a ball of gas, that it was somehow dead, that knowledge killed it. Well, let me say this, that the origins of all life are the temperature, the core of the sun, which is 15 million degrees. You're all here because of that temperature at the core of the sun and the photons boiling out that create life on Earth. So that seems to me just to make the sun even more extraordinary, to know something about it. And so the book is an assault on the idea that science doesn't have moral weight and doesn't have moral value, even though scientists themselves may not tackle and engage themselves with the consequences of the moral implications of what science reveals. But I think it does have consequences for us, and the more we know, the more we realize we are just part of this extraordinary biosphere.
May I ask also, because I haven't read all of your books, I read the one, there's a history of British environmentalism, which is absolutely superb, that I did, but you've written, Mark, besides being an eminent naturalist generally, is probably one of the world's top ornithological writers. So the corpus of his work, the majority of it is actually about birds. So I wanted to ask, did you incorporate science as much in your previous works, or did they fall into the more typical conventional category of nature writing, which was more human-centered? Can you describe where this fits within your oeuvre?
Yes, I can. I mean, I spent 17 years writing 2 books. One of them took me 7 years, called Birds and People, which was over 400,000 words long. And it was essentially an encyclopedic attempt to show people that birds live outside in the environment, but they also live here between our ears. And we make up for them all sorts of ideas, you know. The first swallow, you know, of summer, you know, one swallow a spring does not make, and all these ideas which we have about birds, and the horror we have about starlings, or some people used to hate starlings, and many people hate magpies. In fact, there's absolutely no evidence that magpies have any effect on your garden birds, but we love to think of them as the bad guys. And it was all that moral stuff and projected stuff which I was interested in, but also, of course, the shape of birds in culture. So I spent a lot of time looking at birds in poetry, the importance of the nightingale, for instance. So a lot of the work was showing how wildlife is essential to our imaginative world, that wildlife is central to the ways in which we talk to ourselves about the issues of life. There was science in there, and I tried to follow it through. But, you know, I spent the last 5 or 6 years to write this book. I mean, the other thing is that it took me 2 years. I mean, this is one of the shortest books I've ever written. It's only about 80,000 words. It took me a year to write 40,000 words, and I wasn't doing much else. So that was an incredibly slow reproductive rate. And that was because I needed to master this stuff and transmute it, such as what happens at the center of the Earth in bird migration.
No, so it's a very new direction for Mark in terms of the arc of his entire career.
Yeah.
Now you have referred a few times to the idea of ecological imagination. You coined that term in your book. Now, first, what does it mean? And then I wanted to ask you, you say in the book that the most emotional thing about the swift or birds is their annual migration. Why is that?
Okay, so the first question was
ecological imagination.
Ecological
You've
imagination.
alluded to it, I think, several times, and that's what you hope to pass along with the book.
Yes, well, it's I think of myself as a creative writer, and I I think of the imagination as absolutely essential. But we can't really imagine that that we are dependent upon bacteria. Who loves bacteria? Who can conjure any feeling for bacteria. It's very difficult. You can. You've answered my question for me, but I was going to say, you are all now alive, digesting your breakfast because of anaerobic bacteria, an entire biome, a complex ecosystem in your stomach is what allows you to digest your food and, more importantly, not only enjoy beer, but digest it also. So you can, through your imagination, start to triumph over the invisibility of the biosphere. Only through imagination, actually, can we conjure the life of a swift, because it's only here for 12 weeks of the year, 36 weeks, it's elsewhere across Africa. So my relationship with it is an imaginary thing. I've hardly ever seen a swift's nest. But I think the imagination is our only savior from ourselves. To imagine these other things, I think education is pivotal to this. We need an education that equips us as citizens of planet Earth. But your second question was...
Why is migration, what bird migration, the most emotional thing about them?
Well, I think it's the fact that I live in Derbyshire. I've always had a very close relationship with willow warblers. You're probably thinking he's mad, and you're right. But willow warblers weigh about 12 grams, half an ounce, less than half an ounce. And willow warblers are winter in Angola, in Zimbabwe, in Botswana. I've seen them in southern Africa. And every year they return to the hawthorns near our house. And I just find it absolutely miraculous that these birds can make these extraordinary journeys. That alone, that fact of migration, is truly astonishing. But think this. The Earth has an electromagnetic field. And that is centered at the heart of our planet, because at the very center is a kind of roiling, I don't probe too hard, this is very thin knowledge. So you geophysicists really don't tackle me here. But basically it's a ball about 2,000 kilometers across, which is just moving within it, molten iron largely. And this creates a very faint electromagnetic field around the Earth. And birds have a tiny little microcell of magnetite in the base of their bills, and they're thought to be able to see the electromagnetic field. So most birds are migrating, and this is quite extraordinary in itself. Your willow warbler, my willow warbler, whatever migrant you love, blackcap, chiffchaff, etc., is migrating not just back to, it's not just coming back to Essex. It doesn't love all Essex. As we know, North Essex and South Essex, very different places, Tim. But they come back to that bush, to that tree, to that place. They find their way back. And of course, they use the stars if they're nighttime migrants, like nightingales, or they use the sun and the polarization of the sun and the position of the sun if they're daytime migrants, like, and I can't think of a daytime migrant, probably warblers. But if neither is showing, they are thought to use the electromagnetic field. So they are in direct relationship to the very origins of the planet, because that ball of iron at the center of the Earth was there when the Earth was formed. Don't you find that incredible?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, Mark, it seems like it should be more clear to you guys that obviously one of the missions of the book is to try to kind of reconfigure our relationship, or make us think about our relationship to the galaxy, not even Earth, in a different way. So, Mark, how can we fundamentally reconfigure that relationship? Because clearly, it's one of your greatest bugbears, and the book is addressing that. What changes actually need to be made culturally, educationally, so that we're going to understand that everything is a unitary whole?
Yes, I think the problem with science is it produces the facts. It doesn't see that it has a moral case to make. And people like me are possibly the agents of that transmission to some extent of this information. People like George Monbiot, etc., and other science writers and other popularizers. A fantastic book by Ed Yong called The Immense World, which is a really great book recently come out. So these have moral consequences, but the central thing that we need to do is, if we are truthfully to reorient our lives towards one which is benign to the rest of life on Earth, is to have an education system that equips us to understand our dependence upon the other parts of life. We don't have that. We have it as a kind of, nature is just a bolt-on to our world. We just see it as a Sunday afternoon stroll or something like that. We need an education system that root and branch teaches us citizenship of the planet, and that's what we don't have. In our country, uniquely, I've got more bad news for you guys, other than the 96% of all life is ourselves and our livestock. We have one of the worst records on the planet. We seem blithely indifferent to it, and we are calculated to be the 12th most denatured country on Earth. Of course, you're looking outside, you're thinking it's sunny, it's beautiful, but we have stripped out from our world biodiversity of all kinds. And the only single thing that will deliver a progressive politics that engages this, and now I'm becoming a party political animal, is proportional representation. Because without that, we will never overcome, and I'm reverting here to my book, Our Place, the 18th century system of politics, the binary system, the Bing, the yin and yang, the Bing and bong, the Punch and Judy, the crass nature of our politics, which we've just witnessed the worst of. And I have leaflets for the Green Party for you. I love the Green Party, and I support them. Even the Green Party cannot decenter itself from the humanist tradition which is so alive within the left. And no political party is really engaging with the need to move aside a little bit in all ways to make place for other species. So even the Green Party, it's not as if I'm a more radical and, I'm a kind of eco-fascist or anything like that. No, not at all. I think the only principle on which you could go forward is one of social justice, etc. But we need to start to think about our relationship with other, just as farmers, fantastic farmers who've gone organic and doing amazing things. So I'm interested in the nitty-gritty politics, but this was my biggest, broadest attempt to express it between two covers.
So, Mark, why don't you actually close by reading this quote on your book, 272, which actually encapsulates his overarching mission.
This is interesting because I'm doing a talk in Lancashire, and her questions to me, she sent them. I said, don't bother me sending me the questions. It'd be great to have a conversation.
This isn't me, of course.
This isn't you, no.
I would never send questions
and she's a friend,
in advance, ever.
She's a nature writer, and all her questions were about swifts. Jo, on the other hand, quoted in her little advert for this event the exact sentence, like a laser beam. That's how amazing she is. A round of applause for Jo.
Oh, God. Please, Mark, please.
She got to it straight away, so I'm going to read it for you. This is really the heart of what I'm trying to say. We don't instill a love of our living world so that our participation within the collective living whole we're viewed as the highest ideal of civilization. We have not begun to acquaint ourselves with the truth, by which I mean that we do not enshrine through the most important, heightened ritual practices of our daily lives, educational, moral, legal, economic, and spiritual, the deepest recognition of the deepest truth that we can imagine. We have not converted this storied knowledge to love. That's it, basically.
Okay. On that note, we're going to take a few questions from the audience now.
You're stunned into silence.
Yes, the gentleman at the front, and then the lady in the back. And then please wait until you receive the mic before you pose your question. Thank you.
Mark, do you think that part of the reason we in the West are falling down this huge pit is increasingly in the West we've become a secular society? Now, I'm not a religious fanatic, but the idea of faith used to be part of our existence, part of our reason. If you go up the road to Belsham Water Church and you see the murals there Sorry, you see the murals there. Apart from telling stories from the Bible, they're surrounded by plant forms and birds, and it's like nature was still an important part of their lives. You know, the reason they felt they were there, and we've sort of lost that. So it's not telling everyone to go and join some religious
No.
cult, but this idea of faith.
Yes.
You know, that something's bigger than you and more important than you.
Yes. Well, actually, I don't. I mean, I take your point. The great thing about religion, I mean, I am not a religious person. I'm an atheist. You know, I believe life began through these processes that I describe in the book. Yeah, no. But I think the one extraordinary thing that I can't get round in religion, which means that it's so important, is this issue of faith. The problem with religion, and the other idea is, you know, that there's an overarching narrative now. You've probably heard of it: rewilding, regenerative farming, this, that. If only we could return to some golden age when we really cared about nature. You really have to draw a line under that. We never cared about nature. It was always instrumental to our purposes. Even Amerindians in the deepest, uncontacted Amerindians in the rainforest still think of nature as instrumental, even though they have profound religious and spiritual connections to it. Our trick is to invent some new kind of, not religious feeling, I don't think that's necessary, but I take your point about religion being embedded in an understanding of creation. Of course, what religion teaches is that it was created for us. And this is the central issue that we're faced with, it is our exceptionalism. It is our instrumental understanding of the rest of nature that is problematic. We need somehow to find a new narrative. And this, I suppose, is what's coming. So we're not returning to an old relationship because we never saw it as anything other than instrumental. The difference in the past was when David Attenborough started making programs, actually his programs were called fucking Zoo Quest. He was going to catch animals. No, I know he's a saint. Don't worry, I love him too. It was called Zoo Quest. He was going to capture animals. But the thing that was different then, that didn't really matter, and I have a little dig at zoos too, is there were only 2 billion of us. You know, there are now 8 billion. We're set for 11 billion. This is the challenge, that our numbers go on increasing. So I think religion may have a role, but they've been very, very slow to embrace even issues of climate change, which are essentially about our own futures. But they are making that move, and it would be great to see developments within religion. With the one exception, we had the most amazing guy at our EA Sustain Festival from Bhutan, where Buddhism did enshrine an almost egalitarian understanding of our relationship with the other parts of life. We also had Buddhist-like saints. John Clare is a poet who had that same kind of sense. But those are the challenges we face. So I think religion could play a part, but it's also been part of the problem, is my own feeling about that. Yeah.
Okay. Now that was a long answer, Mark.
Sorry.
Unfortunately, so I wanted to just close the session by reading a quote which actually makes Mark tear up. So I said, Mark, read this quote. He said, no, I'm going to cry. So I'm going to do it instead.
I should just explain, I'm a weeper. You know, I weep at
well-crafted
gravy adverts. So have no pity for me.
Please see Mark afterwards, actually. He'd love to spend more time with all of you and at his walk about Swifts later at 12:30. People ask me sometimes, where can we find hope? I find it problematic, not because I'm lost for suggestions. It is rather that hope is overwhelming, everywhere and without end. Open the door, should you need to remind yourself. You're an embodiment, an inheritor of all of life's 3.8 billion years of storied heritage. You are hope. You are related to everything alive in the world. You are made from the very same stardust as the mite that lives in the curve to the mandible on an Ekaton ant worker's head. Together, we are hope.